Hi everyone, I'm Adrian. I am a PhD student in Dr. Lashley's lab, and I'm here today to tell you about a topic that's very closely related to my research, which is, of course, invasion ecology. So, to get started, I just kind of want to go over a brief definition of what biological invasions are. It originally started being defined as the range expansion of a species into a new area. And of course, this was thought to happen naturally through things like dispersal or species biogeographical barriers disappearing over geological time. But with the increase of human connectivity and human dispersal, of course, we had the Industrial Revolution and people became more connected. So now we have invasions happening at a greater rate because as people are moving, of course, we're moving things with us. And it can be any kind of organism that we're moving, either accidentally or intentionally. So that's what I have here. These kinds of movements are broken down into categories, which I'll talk a little bit about later. But this has actually created a global issue with this increased global connectivity and movement of goods by humans, and it's a severe challenge to biodiversity and conservation efforts. So, with these challenges changing everything we're thinking about and people moving around more and all of us just being connected more, we have a lot of definitions for biological invasions, but I think, of course, the simplest definition is the best, and that is any organism thriving in an area beyond its previous range. And that range is, it can be any kind of a home range, but a place where the species is naturally found. Any movement outside of that naturally occurring area can be considered an invasion, and it can be any organism, so mammals, birds, fungi, seeds, even eggs, but just any kind of organism at all. So there are stages to invasions, and that's kind of what I have summed up in this little figure here. On the left, you see a species arrives in a new location. So this would be stage one. And I have, of course, the little pig there because that's what I'm most familiar with. But of course, we have a lot of examples of invasive plants. And I think anyone in Florida knows of the python situation. But a species arriving in a new location can, as I said, occur naturally. But what we're looking at here is things with human mediated movement. So, movement through shipping lanes, movement through vehicles, and any kind of transportation networks that assist with moving an animal. So, that is how we get these species into new locations. So then we move over to the middle of the screen, and I don't know if I can move this. Okay, there. We move over to the middle of the screen, and this is kind of the second and third stage combined. So the second stage is actually where populations become established in a new area. So they've been transported. The second stage, they just sort of live there. The third stage is when a population reproduces in an area. So that's what I have signified here by my little pigs meeting up together and, of course, having offspring. But this is a key factor. The area where they become established has to be conducive to reproduction for them to actually become invasive. So that's stages two and three. And then the final stage, which is on the left side or the right side of the screen, is when these populations spread to other new areas. So they arrived, they met up, they reproduced, and now they're going even further. And population spread can be brought about by a lot of different things, but invasion is actually assisted through things like land use disturbances, habitat fragmentation, things like wildfires out west, which is why I have this fire right here. They actually allow for more invasive species to move in, or habitat destruction, and as I said, fragmentation. Uh, Fragmenting an area does allow for more invasives to move around easier in some cases, but also it's good to think about climate change, removing some barriers for invasive species. And a good way to think about this is with aquatic invasives. So, as the temperatures warm or the planets warm due to climate change, or the planet warms due to climate change, The ocean temperatures are warming. So species that were once confined in an area due to thermal needs can now move into what was once cooler waters. So now they're competing with the native aquatic species in that area, sometimes outcompeting, but either way, causing a lot of impacts just because of the change in climate. Excuse me. But what I have here at the bottom of this figure is while these species are moving about in search of new areas, they're also foraging, they're living, and they're causing damage to the environment in some cases. And what I have pictured here is, again, some pig damage. So when pigs move around, of course, they forage in the corn. This is a picture of crop damage caused by pigs. And of course, the rooting behavior they do also damages massive amounts of habitats. But this entire process is also associated with social, economic, and environmental impacts, which is kind of what this green circle is signifying in the middle. During this whole process, these 4 stages of invasion, these animals are causing a lot of damage socially, environmentally, and economically. So invasion pathways are really important because it's just, well, the means by which a species becomes invasive. So what allows them to move around. And it's kind of broken down into two different mechanisms. And the first is, of course, natural pathways, which includes all naturally occurring phenomena such as winds and currents. Seeds can be brought to many different regions on winds, but mostly we're looking at invasion due to human mediated pathways. So these are pathways for movements that are created or enhanced by humans. So either the human brings it over and there was no chance of the animal or species getting into an area, or it's just enhanced, such as with currents. Yeah, a species can pick up a current and move to a new area, but it's not as likely as a species that's purposely brought over on shipping lanes, or maybe not purposely, but it's more likely to happen on shipping lanes than just through a current bringing a species over. But the human mediated pathways are also further broken down into either intentional and unintentional, which of course is just intentional is the deliberate movement of a species to a new region outside of its natural home range, and unintentional is the inadvertent movement of species as a byproduct of moving other goods. And what I have here is just examples of ways that invasive species can spread, and this includes things like spreading through agricultural materials. There's a lot of invasive pests that come over that way. Um, Ballast water shipping brings a lot of snails over. I'm not going to go through all of these. This is more just so you are aware. But food trade and its packing materials, I know a lot of people know about various spiders that come over on tropical fruits. Firewood, you can't move firewood between a lot of states. Fishing gear, if anyone's ever been out west to Tahoe, and it may be here as well, but in Lake Tahoe, you can't go into the lake or before you wash your gear off because they're worried about invasive snails, because that is a main way that a lot of bodies of water become infested or invaded is through people moving in and out. So now I just wanted to give you some examples of 4 main categories of invasives, and the first being, of course, a plant, the Imperator cylindrica or Kogan grass, which was native to Asia and was accidentally transported to the US as seeds. So the seeds were in the transport materials. But now, of course, it's all over the South and it displaces native plants, it outcompetes native grasses. But also, it does this and it doesn't provide any value to native wildlife and increases the threat of fire in these areas. So it can change the fire regime. Next, we have Myocastor coipus, which everyone knows is the nutria. It was native to South America, brought over through the fur industry because they thought people would want the fur, which no one does. And the thing with the nutria is it has a very high reproductive potential. It can reproduce a lot and very fast. And it's an aquatic rodent, so it burrows in bodies of water, rivers, streams, lakes, wetlands, and it changes the soil structure when it burrows. So it causes a lot of banks to collapse with these tunnels it makes. It causes a lot of runoff, particulate matter into the bodies of water, so it can be a pollutant as well. And it's very destructive to wetlands because it eats all of the plants. It eats the shoots, the roots, leaves, everything. So it's very bad to have in an aquatic environment. Next, we have Pseudogymnoascus destructans, or PD, which most everyone knows as white nose syndrome, which is an invasive fungus from Europe. It was brought over by cavers who had spores on their boots and came into our caves in the US after being in Europe, and now it has caused declines in species of cave hibernating bats. It basically infects them and it deteriorates their wings, but also causes them to stir during hibernation in the winter, which uses up their fat stores, so they starve to death. And there's no known treatment for this, so it's a very terrible invasive fungus. Lastly, I wanted to tell you about one of the ones that a lot of people don't really know about. It's the giant African land snail. And it was first imported and released in Hawaii in 1936, but this little big snail can consume over 500 different plants. So this was brought in, of course, through the pet trade. It is found in Florida. I'm sure a lot of you have seen them because I have. And it is listed as the most damaging snail in the world because not only does it consume over 500 different plants, it can, in these large groups it lives in, it can erode things like stucco and housing these concretes and stuff like that. So it causes structural damage, and that's an economic loss to these people. So it's really terrible to think that a snail could destroy your house, but it can. But it also carries a parasitic nematode that causes meningitis, so that's a health risk to humans. So these are just four big categories of invasives. And the last one I want to mention that I don't know a lot about is invasive pathogens and diseases, of which there are a lot. I'm sure everyone is thinking about invasive pathogens in these days and ages, but includes disease-causing microorganisms and zoonotic diseases, plant diseases, animal diseases. I have a little bit of a list here. There really isn't an exhaustive list of these. So, I mean, we know of a lot of them, things like chestnut blight, the boxwood blight, avian influenza, things like that. We all know these exist and they are invasive, but the USDA National Invasive Species Information Center is a great resource to look up more information on these. But impacts from invasions vary greatly, and it is known that invasive species are one of the leading threats to biodiversity, and there is a lot of research and a lot of evidence supporting the fact that when a species invades a new area, native biodiversity can increase and increase by a lot, or decrease, I'm sorry, can decrease by a lot. But there's also things like invasives can introduce new traits and genes, which may not be a bad thing. Maybe the population needs new genes, but it can also create hybrids that are not healthy or viable. Introduce new behaviors. You have native species that may be temporarily avoiding invasive species and changing their behavior in that manner. Of course, I showed you examples of invasive species altering ecosystems as they move around. Introduces new biological interactions. Of course, if there's a new species in the area, it's going to interact with other ones, which can transmit everything, spread. So we have that, but it can also help or cause species extinctions, induce species extinctions. There's a lot of evidence of an invasive species or a lot of examples coming in and outcompeting a species completely, and that can be a local or any kind of extinction. Um, but there's also direct impacts on human health. I said like that snail has the parasitic nematode that causes meningitis. That's just one example. There's a lot of the invasive pathogens alone, but also invasive animals that spread diseases. Reduce agricultural production. Like I said, nutria also will destroy crops of rice and various other any kind that lives near the water or is planted near water, they will prey on or forage on. And of course, feral swine also do that. Possible changes to fire regimes, like I said, with the invasive grasses, disease transmission, and as I said, changes in water quality. And nutria can change water quality. And of course, feral swine may also be changing water quality. But these are just some of the impacts that we have from invasion, human health is impacted. There's economic impacts, like I said, crop loss, that's an economic impact. The structural damage caused by the snails and economic. There's a lot of economic impacts, but there's also psychological impacts, such as the fear of these diseases being transmitted. I won't go into too much detail about that, but you can think of, like, just with the snails, for example, people can be afraid of getting this parasite from these snails, but there's a lot of examples out there, and it does cause some psychological effects as well. But these are just a very this is just a very brief overview on some of the impacts from invasions and how biological invasions take place. But if anyone wants to converse more about it, we will have discussions. And of course, there's my email. Feel free to email with any questions.